In the quiet rain of an empty cemetery, Josephine Calloway stood beside the freshly mounded grave of Aunt Della, the last woman in this world who had ever loved her without asking for anything in return. At her side, Winnie, her 6-year-old daughter, all skin and bone, held her mother's hand in a tiny grip that was ice cold, then looked up and asked, "Mommy, is Della cold under the dirt?" Josie couldn't answer. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, gathering every shred of strength just to keep from collapsing in front of her child. She told herself this was the worst day of her life, until she lifted her eyes. At the end of the wet gravel road, a sleek black car sat motionless beneath a row of oak trees. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in black, a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw. He carried a bundle of white flowers, and he walked slowly toward the grave. And when his face came into focus through the curtain of rain, Josie felt the whole world stop turning. She recognized him. Even after 7 years, even though that face was sharper now, colder, more dangerous, older, she still recognized him, because it was the face she had tried to forget every night for 7 years, and had never once been able to forget. But what Josie didn't know was that the boy who had once kicked open a basement door to pull her out of hell when she was 18, then disappeared without a single explanation, was now the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. For 7 years, he had been secretly sending money through Aunt Della to keep her safe, and Aunt Della, the person Josie trusted most, had taken that secret down into the grave. And the 6-year-old girl holding Josie's hand in that moment, the child with black curly hair and a birthmark behind her left ear, was his daughter. A secret that, if exposed, could bring his entire underground empire crashing down and place Josie and her daughter at the center of a fight to the death she never imagined could find them. If you want to know what happened when two people marked by old scars faced each other again after 7 years, hit like to support this story. Share this video with someone you believe will cry when they reach the final part. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the most beautiful stories are still waiting for you up ahead. Brennan walked slowly toward the grave, each step heavy on the rain-soaked gravel. By instinct, Josie pulled Winnie behind her, her arm locking tight around her daughter's shoulders as if she were shielding her from an invisible bullet. Brennan stopped less than 2 meters away. He didn't look at Josie. He looked down at the grave, then slowly placed the bundle of white flowers beside the wilted wreath Josie had bought with the last money in her wallet. His flowers were fresher, more expensive, white and untouched, as if they had been chosen with the careful familiarity of someone who had been buying flowers for Della for a long time. Josie stared at the flowers, then at him, and a question flared inside her, stronger than the pain of losing her aunt. "You knew my aunt." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Brennan straightened, and at last his gray eyes met hers. 7 years. 7 years. And those eyes could still make her forget how to breathe. But Josie was no longer the trembling 18-year-old girl in a dark basement. She clenched her teeth. "You knew my aunt, and you never told me you were alive. You came to her funeral, but you weren't there when I gave birth alone in a public hospital. You're here today, but you disappeared for 7 years. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. She wouldn't let it break, not in front of him. Brennan took each word like a knife, his face unchanged, but his jaw tightening, the faint scar along the left side of his jaw twitching. "Josie, I can't explain this here," Brennan said. "Then where, Brennan? Where in the last 7 years could you explain?" Josie countered, her voice sharp with 7 years of unanswered questions. Winnie tugged lightly at her mother's coat. "Mommy, who is he?" Josie bent down, her voice softening instantly, as if 2 different people lived inside her, one burning with anger, the other ready to shield her child with her life. "Nobody, sweetheart. He's nobody." Brennan looked down at Winnie. His eyes lingered on her black curls, on the blue eyes she shared with her mother, on the way she tilted her head to look at him without fear. Something crossed the cold face of the mafia boss, so fast Josie would have missed it if she had blinked, but she didn't. She saw it clearly. Pain, pure and brutal. He looked back at Josie, and his voice dropped low, almost a whisper, as if he were saying something the world wasn't allowed to hear. "You're not safe, Josie, especially now that Della's gone." "What are you talking about?" "I can't explain today, but you need to trust me on this." "Trust you?" Josie almost laughed. "You disappear for 7 years and tell me to trust you?" Brennan didn't answer. He stepped back, then another step, as if standing near her any longer was something he wouldn't allow himself. Before turning away, He paused, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the black car where Monroe was waiting. Della left something in the nightstand drawer. Find it, then you'll understand. And then he walked away. He didn't look back. Josie stood there watching his figure fade into the rain, her hand still gripping Winnie's shoulder, her chest filling with a chaos she couldn't name. Anger, yes, without question, but also something else. Something she hated herself for feeling. Something she had spent 7 years trying to bury beneath scars and exhaustion. Hope. The black car left the cemetery, leaving Josie and her daughter standing in the rain, beside the grave of the only woman who had ever loved her, and beside the white flowers of the man she thought she had lost forever. Josie waited until Winnie was fast asleep on the old sofa in the living room of Aunt Della's house, before stepping into the bedroom. The room still carried her aunt's scent, lavender mixed with cough medicine, the smell Josie had known since childhood, the smell she breathed in every time her aunt pulled her into an embrace. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, unwilling to touch anything, because touching meant admitting that her aunt was truly gone. But Brennan's words kept echoing in her head like an unrelenting bell. Della left something in the nightstand drawer. Josie sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled the nightstand drawer open. Inside were ordinary things: reading glasses, pill bottles, a worn Bible with a frayed spine, but at the very bottom, beneath the drawer liner, was a rectangular tin box, the kind of old cookie tin Aunt Della used to keep needles and thread. Josie lifted the lid, and the world she knew began to fracture into pieces. The first thing she saw was an old flip phone, the kind people no longer used. She turned it on. The screen glowed weakly, the battery nearly dead but still alive, as if someone had been charging it faithfully until recently. There was only one number in the contact list, saved under a single letter: B. Josie stared at that letter, and her chest tightened. Beneath the phone were envelopes, dozens, nearly 84 white envelopes, stacked neatly, as if someone had arranged them with the careful precision of a person who knew they would one day be found. Josie pulled them out and began to count. Each envelope had a date written on the outside in Aunt Della's handwriting. Inside every envelope was cash. She counted again and again, her hands shaking so badly she had to stop twice. 84 envelopes. 7 years times 12 months. Not a single month missing. Not 1 month in 7 years when the envelopes stopped coming. Not even during the months Josie lay crying on the floor after Garrett beat her face black and blue. Not even the month she fled with Winnie at 3 o'clock in the morning with 1 bag of clothes. Not even the month she believed she was completely alone in this world. Someone had never stopped. The last thing in the box was a letter, Aunt Della's handwriting shaky, clearly written when she was already very weak. Josie, you will be angry with me. I know. You have every right to be. But please read to the end before you judge. 7 years ago, after he left, someone contacted me. He said he couldn't stay with you, because if he did, they would kill you. I didn't know whether he was telling the truth, but the way he spoke about you, Josie, that wasn't the voice of a man who lies. He sent money every month, not much at first, but always on time, never missing. He asked me to keep it secret, said that if you knew he was still here, you would look for him, and if you looked for him, you would be in danger. I don't know who he is now. I only know he asked about you every month, asked if you were well, if Winnie was well, if you needed anything. I told him everything. Winnie's first step, her first word, even the drawings she made of Daddy. I told him all of it, and he listened to all of it. Forgive me, Josie, and if you can, forgive him. He has paid a higher price than you realize. Josie finished the letter and didn't cry right away. She sat motionless on Aunt Della's bed, the letter in her left hand, envelopes scattered around her feet, the old phone in her right hand, and she felt something worse than pain. Betrayal. The woman she loved most, trusted most, the one person who had never let her down, had kept this secret for 7 years. Every time Aunt Della had somehow managed to pay for Winnie's medicine, every time she had saved a little extra to help Josie with rent, every time she said she had a pension so there was nothing to worry about, it had all been a lie. And then Josie looked down at the envelopes, 84 of them, and another truth pierced through her anger like a needle through skin. Someone had thought of her every month. Someone had not forgotten her. Someone had loved her for 7 years without her ever knowing. Loved her in the only way he could, with money in envelopes, with quiet questions sent through Aunt Della, with an absence that, if the letter was true, might have been the very thing that kept her alive. Josie pulled the tin box to her chest, bowed her head, and finally cried. She cried not out of anger, not out of self-pity, but because she didn't know what to do with a love she had never been allowed to know existed. Josie hid the tin box under the bottom layer of her clothes bag and carried it back to her apartment, along with the old phone she didn't know whether to throw away or keep. Life didn't give her time to sit and think about 84 envelopes or Aunt Della's letter. Life demanded that she wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make it to her housekeeping shift at the suburban Hilton, then rush back to pick up Winnie from Phoebe's place, feed her, bathe her, check the nebulizer for her asthma, then run to the bar for the night shift until 1 o'clock in the morning. Every day was the same. Every day was a battle Josie wasn't sure she was winning. Winnie's controller medicine had run out a week ago. Josie called the pharmacy, and they told her the price had gone up. The insurance wouldn't cover this one, and she needed to pay $400 up front to buy enough for a month. $400. Josie made $9 an hour at the hotel, and tips at the bar came and went. After rent, electricity, and the childcare money she paid Phoebe, she had less than $100 left each month. She had cut out her own lunch a long time ago. There were days she ate only the leftover bread the hotel threw away. But Winnie needed the medicine. Winnie wheezed every night, her small chest rising and falling as if she were trying to pull each mouthful of air through a straw. And Josie didn't have $400. She was calculating whether to call the community clinic and beg for free medication when a knock sounded at 11 o'clock at night. Josie knew who it was before she opened the door. Nobody knocked at 11 o'clock at night except Raymond Cutler. He stood in the hallway in a leather jacket, smiling the way men smile when they know they have the power. Josie owed him money from 3 months ago, when Winnie had landed in the emergency room, and Josie had borrowed from him at a brutal rate to pay the hospital bill, because there was no one else left to borrow from. Aunt Della had been very sick then. Phoebe was as broke as Josie. Raymond had been the only option, and Josie knew it was the worst option. But when your daughter couldn't breathe, you didn't get the right to choose. 3 months, Josie. Raymond leaned against the doorframe, his eyes sliding past her shoulder into the apartment, to where Winnie slept on the sofa with a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. He looked at Winnie longer than he needed to, and Josie felt the blood in her body turn cold. "I'll pay," Josie said, forcing her voice to stay steady, though her hand had already clenched around the edge of the door. "Give me more time." "Time?" Raymond let out a small laugh. "You know I'm not a bank, right? I'm a businessman. I invest, and I need my interest." He tilted his head and lowered his voice. "But I'm flexible. I can help you, Josie. Medicine for the little girl, rent, everything. If you know how to show your gratitude." Josie stepped forward to fill the doorway, blocking his line of sight to Winnie. "I'll pay you with money. 2 weeks. I get my paycheck. 2 weeks. Raymond considered it, then nodded slowly. "Fine. 2 weeks. But don't make me come back a third time, Josie. I'm not a patient man, and people who owe me and don't pay, they usually pay with something else." He walked away, his shoes echoing down the empty hall. Josie shut the door, locked it twice, then leaned her back against it and slid down to the floor. Her hands shook, not because she was afraid of Raymond. She'd been used to fear for a long time, afraid of her biological father, afraid of the dark basement at 18, afraid of Garrett's fists. She shook because she was furious, because she was powerless, because she was 25 years old, working 2 jobs, and still didn't have enough strength to protect her daughter from a loan shark. Phoebe came the next morning and pressed $200 in cash into Josie's hand. "Money I set aside for my kid's birthday," Phoebe said, waving her off when Josie tried to refuse. "He's turning 5. What does he need money for? Go buy Winnie's medicine." Then Phoebe looked straight into Josie's eyes, more serious than Josie had ever seen her. "But you've got to find another way, Josie. Raymond's not the type who waits. You know who he is." Josie knew. She had always known. She just hadn't had a choice. That night, after giving Winnie her medicine and waiting until she was asleep, Josie sat on her bed in the dark, Aunt Della's old phone resting on her thighs. The screen glowed faintly, and the letter B sat in the contact list. Her finger hovered over the call button. One press. Just one. And the voice of the man who had sent 84 envelopes would be in her ear. The man Aunt Della said had asked about her every month for 7 years. The man who said she wasn't safe. Josie looked toward Winnie sleeping, her small chest still working too hard. Then she set the phone down on the nightstand and turned it face down. Not yet. She had lived 7 years without anyone. She had given birth alone, run from violence alone, raised Winnie alone. She wasn't going to call the man who had left her just because she was desperate. Josie's pride was the only thing 7 years of hardship hadn't taken from her. She wouldn't hand it over with her own 2 hands. But she didn't turn the phone off. She left it there, face down, on the nightstand, within reach by the width of a hand, just in case. 3 days later, Josie's pride lost. Not to fear, not to loneliness, but to the sound of Winnie's breathing. That night, Winnie had the worst asthma attack she'd ever had. She was asleep, and then she bolted upright, her mouth open, trying to pull in air. But no air seemed to come, her chest tightening, her face turning blue, her blue eyes wide as they locked on her mother with the pure terror of a child who doesn't understand why she can't breathe. Josie lunged for the nebulizer, but there was only enough medication left for 1 dose, the last dose, and when she pressed the button, the machine's hum sounded thin and weak, as if it were about to die. She pulled Winnie into her arms, one hand holding the mask to her daughter's face, the other dialing 911. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. 12 minutes Josie counted second by second. Each second her daughter's wheezing whistle. Each second a silent prayer from a mother willing to trade anything just to let her child draw 1 full breath. In the emergency room, the doctor stabilized Winnie after 40 minutes. She lay on the hospital bed, an oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth, her chest moving more evenly but still fragile, her tiny hand gripping her mother's finger even in the medicated sleep brought on by sedatives. The doctor called Josie into the hallway and spoke in the calm, professional tone Josie recognized as the tone people use when the truth is too heavy to drop in one blunt sentence. Winnie's asthma was getting worse. She needed long-term controller medication, the kind that cost $800 a month and wasn't covered by insurance. And if things didn't improve, she might need a minor procedure to widen her airway. The doctor said more, but Josie didn't hear it. Her ears rang after the number $800 a month. She made less than $2,000. She owed Raymond. Aunt Della was gone. No more envelopes would come each month. Josie sat on a plastic chair outside the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning, alone, under flickering fluorescent lights. Around her were the steady beeps of monitors, the footsteps of nurses, the sharp smell of antiseptic. She looked down at her hands, rough from mopping floors and washing glasses, hands that had once had a pinky finger broken by Garrett, a finger that healed crooked because she didn't have money for the hospital, and now ached every time the weather turned cold. Hands that had held Winnie for 6 years, hands that weren't strong enough to protect her child. She took Aunt Della's old phone out of her coat pocket. She'd carried it with her for 3 days, though she wouldn't admit why. The letter B glowed on the screen. Josie pressed call. It rang once. Only once. And then someone answered, as if that person had kept the phone beside him, always waiting. For 7 years, always waiting for this call. Josie? Brennan's voice, low and rough. The voice of a man pulled from sleep but instantly awake the moment he heard her name. Winnie is at the hospital. Josie said it. Only 5 words. But her voice broke on the last one. Broke in the way 6 years of being a single mother had never allowed her to break in front of anyone. Which hospital? Not a question. A command. 25 minutes later, Brennan walked through the emergency room doors. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair tousled, his eyes red with exhaustion, but his stride was decisive. The stride of a man who had driven across the city at a speed the law doesn't allow. He didn't speak when he saw Josie curled in on herself on the plastic chair. He only sat down beside her, an arm's length away, close enough for her to feel his warmth but not touching her, as if he understood she wasn't ready for that. They sat in silence for 10 minutes, 10 minutes where nothing needed to be said, because sometimes presence is enough. Sometimes a person only needs to know she isn't sitting alone under fluorescent lights at 3 o'clock in the morning to keep from falling apart. Then Josie started to talk. She didn't know why she talked. Maybe she was too tired to hold it in. Maybe 3 in the morning in a hospital is the hour when every wall of defense turns as thin as paper. She told him about 7 years. She told him about 2 weeks after he vanished, when she found out she was pregnant, sitting on a bathroom floor, staring at the test, and not knowing whether to cry or laugh. She told him about 9 months of pregnancy while working, her belly so large she had to bend to scrub floors without even seeing her own feet. She told him about the night she gave birth to Winnie in a public hospital, alone, biting a towel as she screamed because there was no one to hold her hand. Aunt Della came after it was over, held her and cried, saying, "You did so well, you did so well." Then she told him about Garrett Pruitt, the man she met when Winnie was 2, the man who promised her a family, the man she married because she thought Winnie deserved a father even if he wasn't her biological one. She didn't give details. She only said, "He hit me," in a voice so flat it was frightening. The flatness of someone who had lived with it long enough to stop noticing it as abnormal. 2 years. 2 years she endured because she thought Winnie needed a family, until the night Garrett hit her right in front of Winnie, and Winnie screamed, "Don't hit Mommy," in the voice of a 2.5-year-old. That night, Josie ran. 1 bag of clothes, 3 in the morning, no looking back. "I survived without anyone, Brennan," Josie said, her eyes fixed on the wall across from her instead of his face. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel guilty. I'm telling you because you should know who I am now. I'm not the 18-year-old girl you carried through the rain anymore. I'm a woman who has walked through hell more than once and is still standing here. I didn't call you because I need you. I called because my child needs to live. That's all." Brennan stayed still while she spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't justify himself, didn't apologize. He only listened, and when she finished, the silence between them grew heavy as lead. Then he spoke, his voice low and breaking in places the Mafia Boss never let anyone hear. "My mother's name was Catherine. She was beautiful, like you, strong like you. My father loved her in the way he called love, controlling every breath, every step, every person she spoke to. She tried to leave when I was 14. He found her. He didn't hit her. He didn't shout. He only said, 'You're not going anywhere, Catherine. You belong to me.' 3 days later, she hanged herself in the bathroom. I was the one who found her." Josie turned to look at him for the first time since he sat down. Brennan's eyes weren't red, weren't wet, but they were empty in the way of someone who ran out of tears a long time ago. "That's why I didn't dare show up in front of you, Josie. Not because I didn't want to, but because my father, Franklin Kessler, he would do to you what he did to my mother. And I'd rather have you hate me for the rest of your life than find you the way I found my mother." Josie didn't speak. She just sat there beside him under the flickering fluorescent lights. And for the first time in 7 years, the anger inside her didn't disappear, but it shifted to the side and made room for something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Understanding that maybe, just maybe, the man beside her carried scars no less deep than hers. And maybe he had chosen to leave not out of cowardice, but because it was the only way he knew to love her without killing her. The next morning, when Josie woke up on the plastic chair outside the emergency room with a stiff, aching neck and a sore back, she realized 2 things. First, someone had draped a heavy, thick, expensive coat over her. A coat that smelled of sandalwood, a scent she recognized instantly even after 7 years. Second, Brennan was no longer sitting beside her, but when she walked into Winnie's room, the nurse told her the hospital bill had been paid in full. The hospital's top pediatric pulmonologist had been assigned to Winnie's case, and long-term asthma controller medication had been prescribed and already purchased in an amount that would last 6 months. Josie stood in the middle of the room, looking at her daughter sleeping peacefully on the white bed, while the heart monitor beeped in a steady rhythm, and she didn't know what she was feeling. Relief, yes, without question. But there was also something that felt like losing control. The feeling of someone who has spent years swimming alone in deep water and is suddenly pulled onto a boat without being asked whether she wanted to be pulled up at all. Brennan came back in the afternoon, when Winnie was awake and watching cartoons on the small television mounted to the wall. He didn't enter the room. He waited in the hallway until Josie stepped out. "You didn't have to pay my hospital bill," Josie said the moment she reached him, her voice harder than she meant it to be. Brennan looked at her, not arguing, not explaining. He only said, evenly, "This isn't for you. It's for the little girl, and there's something you need to know about Raymond Cutler." Josie folded her arms across her chest and waited. Brennan led her to the end of the hallway where no one passed by, and he spoke in a low, careful voice, like a man disarming a bomb. Raymond Cutler wasn't an ordinary creditor. He wasn't just a loan shark chasing interest. Raymond was an old operative of Franklin Kessler, Brennan's father, going back more than 20 years. His job was very specific, lending money in poor neighborhoods, targeting single women, people with no one to protect them, People so desperate they would accept any kind of help. And when they couldn't pay, he didn't demand cash. He demanded them. He fed them into a pipeline. He turned them into merchandise. Josie felt the floor tilt beneath her. She knew this feeling. She had lived through it. A memory buried for 7 years surged up like a waterfall. She was 18, her biological father drunk, and she remembered him talking on the phone with someone, laughing, saying, "She's young, healthy, you pay me enough and we're done." Then 2 men came, dragged her into a car, and locked her in the basement of a house in the southern suburbs of Chicago. The basement was dark and damp, smelling of mold and fear. She heard a woman crying in the next room. She pounded on the door until her hands bled and no one came. She thought she was going to die there, until she heard the door being kicked in. Not a knock, a kick, hard enough that the hinges gave way. Light poured in from outside, and in that light was the silhouette of a young man, lean, wild-eyed, blood on his hands. Not her blood, but someone else's outside. He looked at her, looked straight into her eyes with gray eyes she had never forgotten, and shouted 2 words in a voice broken by ragged breathing. "Get up, run, now." She didn't have time to ask who he was. She only ran. He carried her when her legs were too weak to keep going, carried her through the pouring rain, through dark alleys she didn't recognize, and she could hear his heart pounding through his soaked shirt against her back. Brennan, 22 years old, a low-level soldier in his father's empire, ordered to guard that basement that night. Instead of guarding it, he kicked the door open and took her out. Josie snapped back to the present, standing in the hospital hallway, looking at Brennan, and everything suddenly fit together like puzzle pieces she hadn't been able to see for 7 years because the most important pieces had been missing. Raymond Cutler worked for Franklin Kessler. Franklin Kessler was Brennan's father. The trafficking ring that nearly swallowed her when she was 18 belonged to the Kessler family, and Brennan had betrayed his own father to save her. "Raymond is doing the exact same thing to you, Josie," Brennan said, his voice restrained, but she could hear the rage boiling underneath. "He lent you money. You can't pay it back. You already know the next step, because you lived through it once." "But Aunt Della," Josie whispered, and suddenly she understood. She understood everything. 84 envelopes, 7 years of steady money. Aunt Della hadn't accepted Brennan's money out of greed, not because she'd been bought. She accepted it because it was the only cushion that kept Josie from ever falling so desperate that she would knock on Raymond Cutler's door. Every time Aunt Della had somehow managed to pay for Winnie's medicine, every time she had saved a little to help with rent, she had been keeping Josie 1 more month away from Franklin Kessler's pipeline. And when Aunt Della died, that cushion vanished. Josie fell straight down, and Raymond had been waiting below. "Della knew," Josie said, her voice trembling not with anger anymore, but with something larger than anger, something like the painful clarity of realizing someone had loved you in a way you never once recognized. "Della knew everything, and she protected me for 7 years. Brennan nodded. "She was the bravest person I've ever known, braver than me, because she had to watch you suffer every day and never be allowed to tell you why." Josie leaned back against the hospital wall and closed her eyes. For 7 years she had hated Brennan for leaving. For 7 years she had been proud that she survived without anyone. But the truth was, she had never been alone. Aunt Della had been there, and behind Aunt Della, in the darkness she couldn't see, Brennan had been there too. She didn't open her eyes when she spoke, because if she did, she would see him, and she wasn't ready for what those eyes still did to her. "I haven't forgiven you, Brennan. I don't know if I can. But Aunt Della, she didn't betray me." "No," Brennan said softly. "She protected you, in the only way she could." Winnie was discharged on a pale, sunny morning. She sat in a wheelchair, the nurse pushed out to the doors, her legs swinging because her feet didn't reach the floor. The oxygen mask gone now, and replaced by the wide grin of a 6-year-old who was happy to leave a hospital room more than she understood. She had just escaped real danger. Brennan was already waiting in the lobby, standing beside a black car Josie knew was worth more than a lifetime of her rent. She almost refused, almost said, "I can call a taxi myself," but then she looked down at her daughter, still breathing a little harder than normal, and she swallowed her pride. In the car, Winnie sat in the back seat, her blue eyes curious as she took in the leather interior she had never seen before. Josie sat beside her, and Brennan drove, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Josie noticed he was driving slowly. Slowly in a way that felt strange for a man used to controlling everything. He drove as if there was something precious in the car. Something so precious he was afraid even a sudden break could crack it. Winnie wasn't a child who could stay quiet for long. She studied Brennan through the rearview mirror, tilting her head one way and then the other, then asked in a clear voice that cut through the heavy silence between the adults. "Mr. Brennan, do you have any kids?" Josie saw Brennan's hands tighten on the wheel until his knuckles went pale. He looked at Winnie in the rearview mirror, and Josie saw his jaw harden, the scar twitching faintly. "Not yet," he said, his voice normal. But Josie heard the fracture underneath it. "I've never gotten to meet them." "That's so sad," Winnie said. And she truly sounded sad. The innocent sadness of a child who didn't know how complicated the world could be. "Not having kids must be really lonely. Do you want me to share my mommy with you? My mommy is really good. She sings to me when I can't breathe." Brennan didn't answer. Josie glanced over and saw him biting down on his lower lip, hard enough that a small bead of blood gathered at the corner of his mouth. He swallowed, his eyes still on the road, but Josie could see his lashes blinking faster than usual. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was trying not to cry because of something a 6-year-old had said. "Thank you," Brennan said after a long moment, his voice rougher. "That's the kindest invitation I've ever been given." The rest of the drive was quiet. Josie held Winnie against her as the child fell asleep from exhaustion, and Josie stared out the window, watching Chicago slide backward behind the glass, and she knew she couldn't keep this secret anymore. That night, in Josie's apartment, after Winnie was sound asleep on the sofa with the blanket pulled to her chin and the new nebulizer humming steadily beside her, Josie sat across from Brennan at the small kitchen table. 2 glasses of water were between them, untouched. "Brennan," Josie began, and she had to stop to breathe, because what she was about to say would change everything, and she knew there was no way back. "Winnie is 6. She was born in March." She looked straight into his eyes and saw the numbers running in his head. 7 years ago. June. The 3 months they had been together. 9 months after June was March. Brennan's face went pale, as if the blood drained from his skin, as if someone had pulled the strength out of his body. "Look at her hair," Josie said softly. "Black curls. No one in my family has black hair. And the birthmark behind her left ear, the size of a fingertip, shaped like a teardrop. Just like yours." Brennan stood up. He didn't speak. He walked toward the living room where Winnie was sleeping and stopped at the doorway. He didn't open the door. He only stood there and looked through the gap, looked at the child curled up, black curls spread across the pillow, the way she slept on her side and tucked herself in, exactly the way Josie still remembered him sleeping 7 years ago. Then Brennan leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. The man Chicago feared, the man his own people wouldn't dare meet in the eye, the man who had spent 7 years building an underground empire with blood and steel, sat crumpled on the floor of a cheap apartment kitchen, his hand covering his face, his shoulders shaking. "I have a daughter." His voice came apart. Not the boss's voice. Not the voice of a man who drove a black car and wore an expensive coat. It was the voice of the lean, 22-year-old Josie had loved, the boy who had never truly disappeared beneath the shell of power. "I have a daughter, and I didn't know for 6 years. Josie lowered herself to the floor beside him, her back against the wall, her shoulder almost touching his. She didn't touch him yet, but she stayed. "She likes to draw," Josie said quietly. "She draws a tall man beside me and her. She writes the word daddy underneath. Every time she finishes, she asks me, 'Does my daddy look like that, Mommy?' And I never know what to say." Brennan dropped his hand from his face. His eyes were bloodshot, his face wet, and he didn't hide it. "I want to meet her, Josie." As her father, Josie looked at him for a long time, looked into gray eyes that were pleading now, eyes of a mafia boss who, in this moment, didn't look any different from the eyes of an orphaned child begging to belong to someone. "Not yet," she said, and she saw him close his eyes as if he'd taken a knife to the ribs. "I need to know your world is safe for my child, Brennan. Raymond Cutler is threatening me. Your father once wanted to kill me. You live in the darkness I've spent 6 years trying to pull my daughter out of. I need to know before I give you anything." Brennan opened his eyes, and Josie saw something change in his gaze. No more pleading. No more raw pain. What she saw was resolve, cold, absolute, dangerous, but not dangerous in her direction. Dangerous toward anyone who dared threaten the little girl sleeping in the next room. I'll burn that whole world down, Brennan said, his voice low and solid as an oath. If it threatens her, brick by brick, name by name, even my own. 2 days later, Brennan brought Josie and Winnie to an apartment on the 12th floor of a discreet building on the north side of Chicago. It wasn't a lavish penthouse. It wasn't a 5-star hotel. It was a normal 2-bedroom place. Warm, tidy, clean, with a refrigerator full of food and an electronic door lock that Brennan said only 4 people knew the code to. Him, Monroe, Josie, and the building manager. Josie stepped inside and immediately knew this wasn't something thrown together in a hurry. Everything, from the curtains to the dishes in the kitchen, had been chosen with care. Not the kind of care of a wealthy man throwing money at an interior designer, but the kind of care of someone who had spent a long time thinking about who would live here. When did you set this up? Josie asked, her hand sliding over the wooden kitchen counter, not a speck of dust. 4 years ago, Brennan said from the doorway. He didn't walk in far. He stayed on the threshold like a stranger in the very apartment he had arranged, in case you ever needed it. 4 years. 4 years he had prepared this place and waited for a day that might never come. Josie didn't know what to feel about that, so she didn't speak. She just led Winnie down the hall to see the rooms. The small bedroom for Winnie was at the end of the hallway, the door painted white, and when Josie opened it, she stopped. The room had been made for a 6-year-old child. Exactly 6. Not some generic child's room filled with teddy bears and pink. On the bookshelf were storybooks right for Winnie's age, the kind with dinosaurs and adventurous princesses that she liked. On the bed was a galaxy print comforter, the kind Winnie always pointed up at the sky and asked about. Mommy, why are there so many lights up there? In the corner was a set of crayons and thick drawing paper, the kind Winnie loved because it didn't tear when she colored hard. Josie stood in the middle of the room and understood. This wasn't a room prepared once 4 years ago. This was a room that had been updated. Every year someone had swapped in new books for Winnie's age, replaced toys, changed bedding. Someone had watched his daughter grow day by day without being allowed to touch her. So he touched her in the only way he could, through small changes in a room she had never once set foot in. Winnie squealed, ran into the room, jumped onto the bed, and hugged a star-shaped pillow. Mommy, this room has dinosaurs. Josie forced a smile, but her eyes were already burning. Then she saw the wooden box. It sat on the nightstand shelf, small and plain, no decoration, just a light-colored wooden box with a tight-fitting lid. Josie opened it while Winnie was busy exploring the crayons. Inside were 6 cards, 6 handwritten cards, each on a different colored paper, in a man's handwriting. Not beautiful, but careful, as if he had shaped every letter on purpose. Josie took out the first one. The paper had yellowed with time. Happy first birthday. I don't know your name yet. I don't even know if you're a boy or a girl, but I know you exist, Della told me. And from today on, every day I think about you. I'm sorry I'm not there. I'm sorry you will never know this card exists, but I'm writing it, because if I don't, I'm afraid I'll forget that I have a reason to live. Josie's hands shook. She took out the second, the third. Each one was a year, each one longer than the one before it, as if the writer had more to say each year to a child he had never met. The 3rd year card read, Happy 3rd birthday. Della says you like dinosaurs. Your dad liked dinosaurs when he was little too. Della says you talk a lot. You talk all day without stopping, and I wish I could hear you. Della sent me a recording of your laughter. I listened to it again and again, 47 times. I counted. The 4th year card read, Happy 4th birthday. Della says you have asthma. I've read everything about it. I've found the best doctor, but I can't take you to an appointment because I don't have that right. I can only send money through Della and hope it's enough. I'm sorry. I'm always sorry. The 5th year card read, Happy 5th birthday. Della sent me a picture of you. You look like your mother. Those blue eyes, that smile, and it's the most wonderful thing I've ever seen in this world. The last one, the 6th year, the handwriting shakier than the others, as if the writer had needed to stop many times. Happy 6th birthday, Winnie. I know your name now. Winnie. Della told me you chose that name for yourself because you love the wind. You said the wind is your friend, because it's always there even when you can't see it. I don't know if you will ever read these cards. Maybe never. But I write your name every day. Winnie. I say your name every morning when I wake up, and every night before I sleep, so I never forget. So I remember that in this world there is a person with my blood whom I have never been allowed to hold. Josie didn't sob out loud. Tears slid down her cheeks in silence, dripping onto the card and blurring a few words. She sat on Winnie's small bed, holding the 6 cards to her chest. And she cried the way people cry when they realize they have judged someone wrongly for 7 years. Not completely wrong, because he had left. He had made her face everything alone, and that was real. But he had not forgotten. He had never forgotten. She looked back toward the doorway and saw Brennan standing in the hallway, not stepping inside. He stood there with his arms at his sides, staring into the room he had prepared for his daughter for 4 years, but staying outside like a man who didn't have the right to cross the threshold. "You knew her name?" Josie asked. Her voice caught tight. "Della told me everything," Brennan said, his voice low and breaking in places he no longer bothered to hide. Her first step, 11 months, holding onto the leg of the coffee table and then letting go. Her first word, "Mama," and right after that, "No." The first time she drew a person, Della sent me a picture. She drew 2 people, one big, one small, then drew a third taller than both, and wrote Daddy under it, even though she'd never met me. He paused and swallowed. His eyes were red, but he didn't cry, as if he had used up all his tears the night before. "I know it all, Josie. I know she likes mac and cheese but doesn't like cheese on pizza. I know she's afraid of thunder but likes rain. I know she asks about her father and you tell her father is a good man but has to be far away. I know everything. But I only got to watch from a distance, through Della's words, through pictures, through recordings. Never once to touch, never once to hold, never once to hear her call me by the name she wrote under the drawing." Josie looked down at the 6 cards in her hands, then at Brennan standing outside the door, and she understood that for 7 years it hadn't been only her who endured. She carried the scar of the one left behind, but he carried the scar of the one forced to leave, and she didn't know which wound hurt more. Josie waited 2 days before going back to the old apartment. She needed to get Winnie's things, clothes, the teddy bear her daughter hugged every night, the only pair of shoes that still fit, and the drawing notebook Winnie refused to leave behind. Brennan wanted to send Monroe with her, but Josie refused. She said she was only going in to grab a few things and leave. 10 minutes. She didn't need a bodyguard to pick up a child's clothes. She was wrong. Josie saw the door before she could even touch it. The lock had been breached, not the crude kind of break-in done with a crowbar, but a clean, professional drill. The kind people use when they want to enter someone's home not to steal, but to send a message. The door was slightly open. Josie pushed it, her heart pounding, and stepped inside. The apartment hadn't been ransacked. Everything was still where it belonged. The cheap television was still on its stand. The little bit of cash she hid in the rice container was still there. Raymond hadn't come to take things. He had come to let her know he could walk in whenever he wanted. Josie went into Winnie's room and stopped. On the small, bear-shaped pillow Winnie slept on every night, a note lay neatly in place, set down with care, as if the person who left it wanted to make sure it was the first thing she saw. 2 weeks, Josie. If you don't pay, I take something else." Josie stared at the note and she didn't shake. She had passed the stage of shaking a long time ago. What she felt was cold. Cold all the way down into her bones. The cold of a mother realizing an enemy had entered her child's room, had touched her child's pillow, had stood there looking at the bed where her child slept. She stuffed Winnie's clothes into the bag with hands trembling not from fear but from rage, grabbed the teddy bear, the drawing notebook, and ran out of the apartment without looking back. On the bus ride back to the safe apartment, Josie called Brennan. She told him briefly, without emotion, only facts, the broken lock, the note on Winnie's pillow, the threat. On the other end, there was silence for 3 seconds. Josie had heard many kinds of Brennan's silence in the last few days. Silence when he learned he had a daughter. Silence when he sat beside her outside the emergency room. But this silence was different. This silence had no breath in it, no feeling, as if someone had flipped a switch inside him. When Brennan spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of the man who had cried on a kitchen floor when he found out he had a daughter. This voice was cold, flat, sharp as a newly honed blade, without a ripple of emotion. "He touched my child's things?" Not a question. Josie heard Monroe's voice in the background, low, professional. "Do you want me to handle it?" "Not yet," Brennan said, still in that flat voice, the voice Josie suddenly understood he used when he gave orders to his empire. "I want to know who's behind him first." Raymond isn't smart enough to do this on his own. Someone's directing him. Find out who. Then he spoke to Josie, his tone softer by a fraction, but still carrying the same coldness underneath. Don't go back to the old apartment again. Anything you need, I'll buy new. You and Winnie stay in the safe place until I finish this. Josie ended the call and sat still on the bus, clutching Winnie's bag against her chest. She had just seen another side of Brennan. Not the father who had collapsed on the floor and cried over 6 birthday cards. Not the 22-year-old boy who carried her through the rain. This was Brennan Kessler, the boss whose name all of Chicago knew and feared. This was the man who had spent 7 years building a darkness thick enough to shield what he loved. And for the first time, Josie didn't know whether that made her feel safer or more afraid. 3 days after Raymond broke in, Brennan came to the safe apartment to meet Winnie. Not as a boss, not as a protector, but as a father meeting his daughter for the first time, even if he still wasn't allowed to be called by that name. Josie stood in the kitchen looking through the glass and saw Brennan outside in the hallway. He had been there 5 minutes and still hadn't knocked. He stood up straight, his hands hanging at his sides, then folding across his chest, then dropping again, like a man who didn't know where his hands belonged. Monroe stood behind him, his face as cold as ever, but Josie saw the corner of his mouth twitch, the twitch of someone trying not to laugh. Then Monroe spoke, his voice even. You faced 20 gunmen at the docks last year without blinking, and now you're afraid of a 6-year-old who weighs 20 kilos? Brennan didn't turn to look at him. He stared at the apartment door as if it were a final gate of judgment. 20 gunmen don't judge me, Monroe. She might. Monroe didn't say anything else. He just placed a hand on Brennan's back and gave him a small push. Brennan almost stumbled, turned to glare at Monroe, but in that moment Josie opened the door. Brennan stood in front of her wearing a dark blue shirt instead of his usual black suit, as if he had spent a long time thinking about what to wear so he wouldn't frighten a 6-year-old. Josie noticed he was clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed, and in his hand he held a small paper bag she didn't ask about. Come in, Josie said, then turned to call into the apartment. Winnie, come here. We have a visitor. Winnie ran out of the bedroom barefoot, her black curls wild because she'd been lying on the floor drawing, still holding a blue crayon. She stopped when she saw Brennan and tilted her head to look him up and down, because he was nearly 3 times her height. Winnie, Josie said softly, crouching beside her. This is a very special friend of Mommy's. His name is Brennan. Winnie looked at Brennan for 3 more seconds, with the assessing stare children have, the stare no adult can fake or escape. Then she said, You're really tall. Can you reach the moon? Brennan dropped to one knee so his eyes were level with hers. Josie saw his knee hit the floor a little heavily, as if his leg had gone weak. I've never tried, he said, his voice gentler than Josie had ever heard it. But if you want me to, I'll try. Really? Winnie grinned. The grin Josie knew was exactly like Brennan's grin 7 years ago, the grin he had lost a long time ago. Really, Brennan said, and Josie heard his voice catch on the word, but he hit it well. Winnie believed him instantly. Children can believe in a way adults lose. She took Brennan by the hand and pulled him into the bedroom, where the floor was scattered with drawings. I'll show you, she said, digging through the pile, then pulling out one page that was wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times. The drawing showed 3 people, a brown-haired woman, a small little girl, and a tall man standing beside them. Under the man, in the uneven handwriting of a 6-year-old learning to write, was the word, Daddy. I drew Daddy, Winnie explained, her voice ordinary, as if she were talking about the weather. Mommy says Daddy had to go far away, but I draw him so when Daddy comes back, Daddy will know I missed him. Brennan took the drawing. His hand trembled. Josie saw it clearly. Trembled so much the edge of the paper shook, and he had to steady it with his other hand. He stared at the drawing for a long time, a very long time, at the tall man Winnie had drawn in blue crayon, faceless because she didn't know what her father looked like, just a tall figure with arms spread wide, standing beside Mommy and her. He swallowed, then swallowed again. Winnie watched him and tilted her head. Mr. Brennan, your eyes look like someone who's sad. Like my teacher when she told a story about the dog she lost. Her eyes looked just like that. Brennan looked down at Winnie, the 6-year-old daughter he had written birthday cards to every year, whose name he had spoken every morning and every night, whom he had loved from a distance with envelopes and quiet questions sent through Aunt Della. The daughter standing in front of him now, alive, breathing, smiling, asking him about the moon. "They used to," he said, his voice soft and breaking. But he smiled. A small smile Josie had never seen on the face of this 29-year-old man. A smile with no darkness in it, no power, only the smile of a father looking at his child for the first time. But not anymore. That night, Josie couldn't sleep. She lay there listening to Winnie's steady breathing beside her, steadier than it had been on so many nights before because of the new medication, and she kept thinking about the daddy drawing, about the way Brennan held that paper with trembling hands, about the small smile he'd given Winnie before he left. A smile Josie knew would haunt her for many nights to come. She got up close to midnight, pulled on a coat, checked Winnie one last time, and stepped outside. She didn't know why she went up to the rooftop. Maybe she needed air. Maybe she needed a stretch of sky wide enough for thoughts that didn't fit inside four walls. But when she pushed the rooftop door open, Brennan was already there. He stood close to the railing, looking down at Chicago. The city spread below like a carpet of light. The wind tugged at his shirt, and the scar along the left side of his jaw caught the streetlight from below. He didn't turn when he heard the door, but he knew it was her, because he said softly, "Is she asleep?" "Yes," Josie said, walking up to stand beside him at an arm's length. Out cold, hugging the daddy drawing. Brennan didn't say anything. They stood for a while, looking at the city, and Josie felt something strange. Not comfort, not yet, but the absence of tension, as if standing beside him in silence at midnight was something her body remembered, even when her mind had tried to forget. "Rooftops," Josie said, almost a whisper. "Do you remember?" Brennan turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw that he did. He remembered everything. 7 years earlier, summer, the tiny one-bedroom apartment he rented with the meager pay of a low-level soldier, so he could hide her after the night he kicked in that basement door. Josie had been 18 then, thin, terrified, trusting no one. Brennan had been 22, thin too, afraid in his own way, but hiding it behind hardness. He slept on the sofa and gave her the bed. Every morning he left food outside her door, knocked twice, then walked away, not forcing her out, not forcing her to talk. It took her 3 weeks before she opened the door while he was still standing there, and when she did, he only said, "Are you hungry?" As if 3 weeks of silence was the most normal thing in the world. Then they started to talk. About childhood, both of them with violent fathers. About dreams, she wanted to be a nurse. He wanted out of his father's empire. About fear, both of them afraid that one day they would become versions of the very men who raised them. He cooked for her and burned everything he touched. Burned eggs, burned rice, even burned a pot of instant noodles because he forgot to turn off the stove when he heard her laugh. She laughed a lot in that apartment, more than all the years before it put together. And at night, they went up to the rooftop. A tiny, dirty rooftop full of ventilation pipes. But when they looked up, the stars were bright, because that neighborhood didn't have many streetlights. They lay on an old blanket and counted them. He didn't know the names of any constellations. Neither did she. So they made up their own. The burned pot constellation. She pointed up and laughed. And he laughed too. And his laughter then, at 22, clear and unguarded, was something Josie had tried to forget for 7 years, and had never once been able to forget. Their first kiss happened on that rooftop too. He didn't start it. She did. She held his face in both hands and kissed him, and when he pulled back and asked, "Are you sure?" she said, "You're the first person who ever let me choose. Everything before was taken from me. This time, I choose." 3 summer months, the happiest of both their lives. Until the last night. Josie remembered that night as clearly as she remembered her own name. They lay on the bed in that small apartment, her head on his chest listening to his heartbeat, and she said, "Promise me you won't go anywhere." Brennan was silent too long. She lifted her head and saw him staring at the ceiling, eyes open, jaw clenched. "Brennan? I promise," he said, but his voice was wrong. Josie heard it, but she was too tired, too happy, too desperate to believe, so she closed her eyes and fell asleep. The next morning she woke up alone. The other side of the bed was cold. On the pillow was a torn piece of notebook paper. His handwriting rushed. "Don't look for me. Forget me. It's the only way you'll be safe." She didn't cry then. She just sat on the bed holding the note for a long time, then folded it, slipped it into her pocket, and stood up. She was used to being left. Her father left her in the way a man sells a thing. Brennan left her in the way a man disappears. She stood up because it was the only thing she knew how to do. 7 years later, on the rooftop of a different building in the same city, Josie stood beside the man who had left that note, and she did something she never thought she would do. She lifted her hand and touched the scar along his left jaw. Brennan went completely still as her finger traced the scar from near his ear down toward his chin. A thin but long line, the kind made by something sharp, not an accident, but deliberate. "Who did this to you?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "My father," Brennan said, his voice even, like he was telling someone else's story. "The night I refused the order to kill you." Josie's finger stopped on the scar. "An order to kill me? You knew too much," Brennan said, his eyes on the city instead of her, as if looking at her right then would keep him from speaking. "You were in the basement of the pipeline. You saw faces. You heard names. Under my father's rules, you had to be handled. He ordered me to do it because I was the guard that night. It was his test, always a test, forcing his son to get blood on his hands to prove loyalty." He paused and breathed. "I said no." He took a knife. He touched the scar. Then he said if I wouldn't do it, he would do it himself, and he would make me watch. So I kicked the door in. I took you out. And I knew from that night on that if he found you, he would kill you just to teach me a lesson. "So you loved me for 3 months?" Josie said slowly. "And then you left because he found out?" "He gave me 2 choices," Brennan said, his voice now so low the wind almost stole it. "Leave you and work for him, or stay and watch you die." He wasn't bluffing, Josie. He killed my mother by trapping her in that marriage until she ended her own life. He wouldn't need to kill you with his hands. He would trap you, control you, choke you, until you didn't want to live. Josie pulled her hand away from the scar. She stood there, the Chicago wind moving between them, and she felt something rearrange itself inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a shift in the way she saw the last 7 years. She had always thought she was the one left behind. She had always thought Brennan chose to go. But the truth was that both of them had been trapped, in different ways, by people who should have loved them. "We both carry scars from people who were supposed to love us," Josie said softly. Brennan turned to look at her, and in the streetlight rising from 12 floors below, Josie saw his eyes go wet. Not crying, just wet, like the surface of a lake when the wind first touches it. "Mine are visible," he said, touching his jaw. "Yours aren't, but I know they're there. I've always known." They stayed on the rooftop until the sky was close to morning, not saying much more, just standing beside each other and watching the city slowly wake up. And Josie thought that maybe this was the beginning, not of forgiveness, not yet, but of 2 scarred people learning how to stand next to each other without it hurting. In the days after that night on the rooftop, Brennan started coming to the safe apartment every day, not coming and going like a guest, but coming and staying, sitting on the living room floor with Winnie, drawing with her even though he drew so badly that Winnie had to take his hand and instruct him. "Not like that, mister. Brennan, cats don't have 6 legs." He made pancakes in the morning and burned the first batch, smoke filling the kitchen, Winnie laughing so hard she had to clutch her stomach, and Josie stood by the refrigerator and saw something she didn't expect. Brennan laughed too, not the small, controlled smile he used when he spoke to her, but real laughter, laughter that narrowed his eyes and softened the scar along his jaw, and Josie realized it might have been the first time in many years he had laughed without holding anything back. The second batch of pancakes still burned. The third batch was edible, a little raw in the middle. But Winnie declared it the best in the whole world, and ate every bite. Brennan watched his daughter eat with a look Josie had to turn away from, because she couldn't bear the way he looked at Winnie, as if she were a miracle he didn't dare believe was real. At night, he read Winnie stories before bed. He gave every character a different voice, a deep voice for the bear, a high voice for the rabbit, a rumbling voice for the dragon, and Winnie laughed so hard her asthma almost flared again, but she still begged, "One more, one more." Josie sat in the doorway listening and thought about how the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was doing a princess voice for his 6-year-old daughter, and she didn't know whether she wanted to laugh or cry. He took Winnie to pick up her asthma medication and asked the pharmacist so many questions Josie had to tug him away. What were the side effects? Would long-term use affect development? Was there an option with less steroid? What if she missed a dose? What if she took 2 doses? The pharmacist looked at him with an expression that was patient and exhausted at once, and Monroe stood behind him, his face stone cold, but Josie would swear she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. But the moment Josie knew everything had changed wasn't in the burned pancakes or the bedtime stories. It was one night, late, when Josie woke to get water and passed by Winnie's room. The door was cracked open. Brennan was sitting on the floor beside the bed, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out. He wasn't asleep. He was just sitting there, watching his daughter sleep, and Josie thought he could sit like that all night. Then Winnie shifted. She curled in, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and in her sleep, in that small, foggy voice only children have when they talk in dreams, she whispered, "Good night, Daddy." Brennan froze. His whole body went still, as if those two words were a bullet through every layer of armor he had built over 7 years. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just sat there looking at his daughter, and tears slid down both sides of his face in silence. Not a sound. Josie stood in the doorway. She saw everything. He didn't know she was there, or maybe he did, but he no longer had the strength to hide. She didn't step inside either. She stayed on the threshold, her hand clenched around the doorframe, and her own tears fell too. No one spoke. In the small apartment at midnight, there was only Winnie's steady breathing, the ticking of the wall clock, and the sound of tears falling from two scarred adults, learning how to heal beside the child they both loved more than their own lives. While Josie and Brennan were learning how to rebuild what 7 years had stolen, on the other side of the city, deep inside a guarded estate tucked among the mansions in the western suburbs of Chicago, one phone call was changing everything. Raymond Cutler stood in the parking lot of a cheap supermarket, a disposable phone pressed to his ear, and he told Franklin Kessler everything he knew. That Josie Calloway, the woman who owed him money, had vanished from her old apartment, that he had followed her and discovered she was taken to a building on the north side of the city in Brennan Kessler's car. That Brennan went there every day, stayed for hours, and through a window Raymond had seen Brennan sitting on the floor playing with a child, a little girl with black, curly hair. Franklin Kessler was 68 years old. He sat in a leather armchair beside a fireplace and listened without interrupting. His mansion was large and beautiful, but it was a prison. Brennan had stripped him of all real power 5 years ago, kept him alive because of blood, but cut off every line of contact with the empire outside, every line except Raymond. Raymond was the loyal dog Brennan didn't know, still ran back to the old master. Because Raymond feared Franklin with a fear that had seeped into bone over 20 years, a fear Brennan's new power couldn't erase. "A little girl," Franklin said slowly, tasting the 2 words on his tongue the way he might taste a drink. "Black curly hair. How old?" 5 or 6, Raymond said. "Small, thin, smiles a lot." Franklin was quiet. In his mind, the numbers slid into place the same way they had slid into Brennan's head when Josie said Winnie was 6, 7 years ago. The strange girl Brennan had betrayed him to save. The 3 months they were together before Franklin forced Brennan to choose. And now, a 6-year-old child. "Kessler blood," Franklin said, and his voice held no anger, no surprise, only something that sounded like satisfaction, the cold satisfaction of a chess player who has just seen a move his opponent never expected. "My son has a child he didn't plan for. Interesting." He set the phone down, rose, and walked to the only photograph on the mantel, a photo of a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes, beautiful in the way sadness can sometimes make a person more beautiful. Catherine Kessler, his wife, Brennan's mother, the woman who had hanged herself in the bathroom because he had loved her by locking her in. Franklin looked at the picture and spoke, his voice low, almost gentle, but gentle in the way a scalpel is gentle as it cuts through skin. "You wanted to take the boy too. You wanted to take Brennan away from me. You said I would destroy him." He touched the glass, his finger gliding over Catherine's face. "But no one takes my child from me, Catherine. You couldn't. And that girl won't either." He turned back to his chair, picked up the phone again. "Raymond, listen. The child is Kessler blood. If I have the child, I have my son. Brennan will never abandon his kid. He's like his mother in that way, weak because of feelings." He gave a small laugh, dry. The laugh of a man who has forgotten how to laugh from joy and only laughs from calculation. "Don't act yet. Wait for my order. But watch the girl. Know where she goes, what she eats, where she sleeps. I need to know everything." He ended the call, looked back at Catherine's photograph, and in the vast, silent, guarded mansion, Franklin Kessler sat alone beside the fire, planning to take back what he believed belonged to him, using the only thing his son loved more than his own life. The specialist Brennan arranged examined Winnie 3 times in 2 weeks, and the final conclusion was that she needed a minor procedure to widen her airway. It wasn't dangerous, the doctor said. It was common in children. The success rate was very high. She would be under anesthesia for about 45 minutes, and then it would be done. The doctor spoke in a calm, professional voice, but Josie didn't hear anything after the 2 words, under anesthesia. Her daughter was 6 years old, weighed 20 kilos, and she would lie on an operating table, drifting away under medication, and Josie wouldn't be allowed to stand beside her and hold her hand. That was all Josie could hear. On the day of the procedure, Josie helped Winnie into the hospital gown, tied her hair back neatly, and when the nurse wheeled Winnie's bed through the operating room doors, Winnie waved and said, "Don't worry, Mommy. I'm strong. I'm a dinosaur." The doors closed, and Josie stared at them. Stared until her legs went weak and she had to brace herself against the wall. Brennan guided her to the waiting room. It was a small room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, just like the emergency night a week earlier. But this was worse, because this time it was planned. This time she had willingly handed her child over to surgery, and even if her mind said Winnie would be fine, her body didn't listen to her mind. Her body listened to fear. The fear of 7 years. Josie sat on a plastic chair with both hands clenched on her knees, staring at the floor, and she felt everything she had compressed for 7 years begin to crack. Not slowly. It cracked like a dam under too much pressure, bursting all at once, everything at once. 7 years of giving birth alone. 7 years of lying awake at night listening to her child breathe. 7 years of working double shifts, eating leftover bread, counting every dollar. 7 years of being hit, being left, being threatened. 7 years of telling herself, "I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine," until it became a habit and she forgot she had never been fine. Brennan sat beside her, and he must have seen the wall inside her collapsing, because he reached out his hand. He only reached out. He didn't touch her. He waited for her, and Josie didn't take his hand. She punched his chest. She turned and punched him with her small, rough fist. Once, twice, 3 times. Not hard enough to hurt him, but hard enough to pour 7 years out through every blow. "Why did you have to come back?" she said, her voice not shouting but breaking. Breaking in a way worse than shouting because it was the voice of someone who had held too much for too long. "I was used to it, Brennan. I was used to being alone. I was used to not needing anyone. I built the wall, and you came back and tore it down." She hit him once more, weaker, and then her hand grabbed his shirt instead of striking, clenching the fabric and not letting go. "I was used to living without you. Why did you come back and make me remember how lonely I am?" Brennan didn't dodge. He didn't grab her hands. He didn't say "I'm sorry," because they both knew sorry wasn't enough for 7 years. He only held her, both hands closing around her shoulders, holding her tight, steady, patient, holding her the way you hold something that's breaking so it doesn't hit the floor and shatter into 100 pieces. "You don't have to live like that anymore, Josie," he said, his voice low and broken right beside her ear, his warm breath in her hair. "You've been strong enough. You've proved it. You don't have to prove it again." Josie lifted her face. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, and she looked at him from inches away, close enough to see every millimeter of the scar along his jaw, close enough to see herself reflected in his gray eyes. Then she kissed him. He didn't kiss her. She kissed him. Just like 7 years ago on the rooftop of that small apartment. She was the one who chose, because she had always needed to choose instead of being taken. The kiss wasn't wild. It was slow, trembling, and salty with both their tears. A kiss between 2 people who had lost each other for 7 years, who carried scars from different hands, who had survived hell in different ways, and somehow found each other again in a hospital waiting room under fluorescent lights. They broke apart when the nurse came out and said the procedure was a success. Josie wiped her tears and rushed into recovery, Brennan following. Winnie lay on the bed, her eyes hazy because the anesthesia hadn't fully worn off. But when she saw her mother, she gave a weak smile. Then she saw Brennan standing beside Josie, and she looked down at their hands, 2 hands holding each other without either of them realizing when it happened. Winnie's smile widened, tired but bright, and she said in a hoarse voice from where the breathing tube had just been removed, "Now we look like a real family." Winnie was discharged 2 days after the procedure, recovering with the speed only children seem to have. already running around the hospital room and demanding to go home because the hospital doesn't have enough colors of crayons. Brennan wasn't there that morning because he had a meeting at Kessler Holdings. Couldn't postpone, so Monroe was sent to the hospital to bring mother and daughter back to the safe apartment. Josie needed to sign the discharge papers and pick up prescriptions, so she told Monroe, "Watch Winnie for 5 minutes. I'll sign and come right back." Monroe nodded. He stood beside Winnie in the waiting area, the child sitting on a chair with her legs swinging, hugging the teddy bear Josie had retrieved from the old apartment. 30 seconds. That was all it took. Monroe's phone vibrated. An internal Kessler Holdings number, the kind of call he couldn't ignore because it might involve Brennan's security. Monroe turned his back for 30 seconds to take the call, his eyes still flicking toward Winnie, but 30 seconds was enough. When Monroe turned back, the chair was empty. The teddy bear lay on the floor. Winnie was gone. Monroe scanned the lobby in 2 seconds, then moved fast to the reception desk, asking in a voice that made people answer immediately. The receptionist said a man had just led a little girl with black hair out through a side exit, telling her, "Daddy sent me to pick you up," and the child had gone with him because she heard the word Daddy. Josie walked back into the lobby with a stack of papers in her hands and saw Monroe standing in the middle of the room, his face drained of color, the first time she'd ever seen any expression on that usually stone-cold face, and the teddy bear on the floor. No one had to explain. She looked at the empty chair, the bear, Monroe's face, and she understood. The papers slipped from her hands and scattered across the hospital floor. Josie screamed. Not the scream of fear, but the scream of a mother animal whose child has been ripped away. A sound torn from the bottom of her lungs, echoing through the hospital lobby, freezing people in place, sending nurses running, security grabbing radios. Monroe called Brennan. Josie couldn't hear the words because her ears were ringing, but she saw Monroe speak very briefly, only a few words, then pull the phone away from his ear, as if the sound on the other end was too violent to hold close. Brennan arrived at the hospital in 15 minutes. When he walked into the lobby, Josie saw the transformation she'd glimpsed over the phone when Raymond broke in, but this time, it was right in front of her, and it was more terrifying than she'd imagined. Brennan's gray eyes went dark, not changing color, but something behind them switched off. Something human, something warm that Josie had seen when he looked at Winnie, when he held the daddy drawing, when he read stories in a princess voice. It was all gone. What remained was cold, a primal cold, the cold of a man who has killed and is ready to kill again. His voice turned to steel as he spoke to Monroe and 4 men Josie didn't know where had come from. "Lock everything down. Activate all sources. Every camera within 5 miles. Every one of our people on the streets. Find my child." Then he stopped, and the next sentence he spoke was quieter but heavier than any threat Josie had ever heard. "Anyone who touches my child dies." Monroe, who had followed Brennan for more than 10 years, who had seen him face 20 gunmen without blinking, who had watched him build an empire with blood and steel, for the first time, Josie saw it clearly, was afraid of his boss. But Josie didn't collapse. She had cried. She had screamed. And now she wiped her tears with the back of her hand, that rough hand from mopping floors and washing glasses, and she stopped crying. Not because the pain was gone, but because she didn't have the right to fall apart right now. Her daughter was out there, with someone, frightened, alone, and Josie was not a woman who waited for a man to save her. She never had been. She pulled Aunt Della's old phone from her pocket, the phone she carried with her every day like a talisman, and she called Monroe before Brennan could issue another order. Monroe answered, surprised by the unknown number. Josie spoke, her voice steady, unbroken. Her voice was steel, a different steel from Brennan's, the steel of a mother. "I know who took my child. Franklin Kessler. He wants the girl to control Brennan. Take me to that house. Now." Monroe looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at Josie. And in the dark, cold eyes of the Mafia Boss, Josie saw something flash. Not surprise, but something like respect. The respect of a man realizing that the woman standing in front of him, thin, rough-handed, her face wet with tears, was no less dangerous than he was. Winnie sat in an armchair far too large for her body, her feet not touching the floor, both arms wrapped tightly around herself because her teddy bear had been left behind on the hospital floor, and she had nothing else to hold. The room around her was larger than any place she had ever lived with her mother. High ceilings, chandeliers, polished wooden floors reflecting the small legs that swung slightly in the air. She didn't cry. She wanted to cry. her lower lip trembling and her eyes burning. But she remembered her mother saying that when she was scared she should breathe deeply and count to 10, so she breathed and counted. She had counted to 10 17 times already. The man sitting across from her didn't look like anyone she had ever met. He was old, his hair white and slicked back, wearing a suit even though he was indoors. And he looked at her with an expression she didn't understand. Not angry, not happy, not sad, but the way grown-ups look when they are calculating something, the way her teacher looked at a test before grading it. Franklin Kessler looked at the child sitting in front of him and saw Brennan. Saw Brennan at 6 years old, with the same black curls, the same thin frame, sitting in a chair too big for him, with his legs dangling, not touching the ground. The resemblance tightened something in his chest, in a way he refused to acknowledge as feeling. "Do you know who your grandfather is?" Franklin asked, his tone no different from ordinary conversation, as if kidnapping a child were an everyday matter not worth changing one's voice over. Winnie looked at him, her head tilting slightly in the way Josie always said meant she was thinking. "I don't have a grandfather," she said, her voice small but steady. "I only have Mommy. And Aunt Della, but Aunt Della is gone. And now I have Daddy too." "Daddy," Franklin repeated, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You have an entire family you don't know about, little one. You carry Kessler blood. Do you know what that means?" "I don't know, Kessler," Winnie said. "I'm Winnie Calloway." Franklin watched her for a long moment. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't cry, didn't beg. She looked straight at him with her mother's blue eyes and her father's stubbornness, and Franklin realized he couldn't intimidate this child. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. He could see her small hands clutching her own arms, but because she was afraid and still wouldn't bow. Just like Brennan. Exactly like Brennan at 14, standing in front of him after finding his mother in the bathroom, eyes red but dry, terrified but unbent. Winnie was silent for a long time, her legs stopping their swing, and then she spoke softly, almost a whisper, but every word was clear. "Daddy will come. Daddy always comes." Franklin stiffened, not because it was a threat. The words of a 6-year-old weren't a threat, but because that sentence, that structure, that absolute unshakable belief, was exactly like something he had heard more than 20 years earlier. Brennan, 6 years old, sitting outside the bedroom door where Catherine had been locked for disobedience. Franklin had passed by and heard the boy whisper to the closed door, "Mommy will come get me. Mommy always comes." But Catherine never came to get Brennan. She never escaped this house. She chose death rather than continue living in the cage Franklin called love. Franklin looked at Winnie, at her blue eyes, and for a very brief moment, so brief he almost didn't register it, something like regret brushed across his chest. Then it vanished. He pushed it away the way he had pushed all feeling out of himself for 40 years, and his face returned to calm. "Your daddy will come," Franklin said, nodding slowly. "I know. I'm counting the minutes." At the same time, on the highway cutting through the city, Josie sat in the back seat of the car Monroe was driving, with Brennan beside her. He was on the phone constantly, his voice sharp and clipped, issuing orders to people Josie didn't know, deploying things she didn't want to understand. But between 2 calls, in 3 seconds of silence, Josie did something she didn't plan. She reached out and took Brennan's hand. The first time she had ever taken it. Not while crying, not while kissing, not while breaking, but when she was at her strongest, when she was a steel mother ready to face a 68-year-old mafia patriarch to get her daughter back. She took his hand because she chose to, not because she needed to. Brennan looked down at her hand, small and rough, gripping his with a strength that didn't match its size. Then he looked at her. He didn't speak, but his jaw tightened, the scar along it stretching, and in his eyes, still dark with anger that hadn't cooled, Josie saw something else as well. A vow, not spoken aloud, carried in the way he tightened his grip on her hand and didn't let go. He would not lose anyone else. Not this time. The car stopped at the gates of Franklin Kessler's estate just as night was falling. Brennan got out first, his eyes sweeping the iron fence, the massive gate, the security cameras mounted at the corners. He knew this place the way he knew the lines on his own palm, because he had grown up here, grown up inside these walls, and he hated every single brick. Monroe had positioned people around the property 20 minutes earlier, silent and professional, covering every entry and exit, not to attack, to make sure no one left with Winnie if things didn't go as planned. Brennan looked at Josie, still sitting in the car, her gaze locked on the mansion with the look of someone forcing all her rage into a tight fist just to keep her mind clear. "Stay here," Brennan said. "I'll go in." "No. Josie. My child is in there, Brennan. You think I'm sitting in the car and waiting?" Brennan held her gaze for 3 seconds, then didn't argue, because he knew arguing with Josie once she had decided was pointless. Monroe opened the door for them. He leaned close and spoke quietly to Josie as she stepped through. "Stay behind Mr. Kessler. Don't split up." Josie didn't nod or shake her head. She just walked. The mansion's front doors opened without a knock, as if Franklin had been waiting, as if all of it were a performance he had directed and Brennan had arrived right on cue. The living room was enormous, the fireplace lit, and Franklin Kessler sat in a leather armchair like a king on a throne. He wore a gray suit, his white hair slicked back, a glass of liquor on the side table that he hadn't touched, placed there like a prop for the image of power he wanted to display. Brennan stopped in the center of the room. Father and son faced each other, and the air thickened into something Josie felt like pressure against her chest. "My son," Franklin said, his tone calm, as if Brennan had come for dinner. "Faster than I expected. Where's my daughter?" "Not a question." Franklin took a slow sip, set the glass down. "Safe. Sleeping in the room down the hall. No one touched her. She's Kessler blood. I don't harm my own blood." "So my mother wasn't your blood?" Brennan said, his voice flat. But Josie heard the blade underneath. Franklin didn't blink. "Your mother was weak. She couldn't endure this life." "She couldn't endure you," Brennan said. "Those aren't the same thing." Franklin rose slowly, and even at 68 he was still tall, still carrying a kind of authority age hadn't erased, an authority built from 40 years of making people afraid. He walked toward Brennan. "I have an offer. The child is Kessler blood. She belongs to this empire. You took everything from me, Brennan. Power, men, money. You locked me in this house like an animal, but the child changes everything." He stopped in front of Brennan, close enough that they could see every line in each other's faces. "Give me control of the empire again. Let me raise the child. She will be a worthy heir, not raised in a broken apartment with her mother, and you will keep her, close to you, and no one gets hurt." "You locked me up for 29 years, Brennan said, and his voice wasn't cold anymore. It was hot now, hot like lava moving under stone, and Josie saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. 29 years you controlled me, forced me to kill, forced blood onto my hands, forced me to leave the woman I loved, forced me to become your version of me. You will not lock my daughter up for 1 day, not 1 hour, not 1 minute." Franklin's mouth twisted. "You're weak for women, Brennan. Always have been. Just like your mother, she was weak too. Let feelings cloud her mind. And look how she ended." The room went silent. Brennan didn't move, but Josie saw the scar along his jaw jump hard, like a current running through him, and she knew he was on a line. The line between son and boss, between control and eruption. Then footsteps. Not Brennan's, not Franklin's. Josie walked into the living room. Monroe moved after her, one hand lifting as if to stop her, then stopping when Josie looked back at him with a stare that made him step back. She walked past Brennan, straight toward Franklin, and stopped in front of him. She was thin, nearly a head shorter than he was. Rough hands, her face still marked with tears that hadn't fully dried. She had no weapon, no power, no empire, but she didn't tremble. "You call love weakness?" Josie said, her voice neither low nor loud, neither shaking nor shouting. The voice of someone who has walked through too many hells to fear one more devil. "That's why your wife chose death over living with you." Catherine wasn't weak. She was stronger than you ever understood, because she had the courage to leave when you gave her no other way out. Franklin went pale. No one said Catherine's name in this house. No one dared, but Josie didn't stop. "And that's why your son chose me over you. Not because he's weak, but because he sees what you never could. That people stay because they are loved, not because they are caged. You caged your wife and she died. You caged your son and he rebelled. You kidnapped your granddaughter and you think it will end differently? You didn't lose them because they were weak. You lost them because you don't know how to love without crushing." Franklin stood motionless. For the first time, Josie saw him without an answer. For the first time, the mask of power cracked, and beneath it wasn't a monster, but a lonely old man who had destroyed everything he ever loved because he never learned the difference between love and possession. Brennan looked at Josie, and in his eyes, between rage and darkness. She saw something she didn't expect. Shock. For the first time in his life, Brennan Kessler looked at someone and realized she might be more frightening than he was. Monroe took the cue. Brennan's people entered from every doorway, silent, efficient. Franklin looked around and understood that he had lost before the fight even began, that Brennan hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to take his child back, and the offer had only been a way to buy time while Monroe finished positioning everyone. "Which room is Winnie in?" Brennan asked Franklin, his voice quiet now, a quiet that was terrifying. Franklin sank back into the leather chair slowly, like a king who had lost his kingdom but refused to lose his posture. He pointed toward the hallway on the right. Brennan moved fast down the hall and Josie ran after him. He opened the third door, and Winnie was there, sitting on a large bed with her knees pulled up, her arms wrapped tight around them because she didn't have her teddy bear to hold. When she saw Brennan in the doorway, her eyes went wide, and she jumped down from the bed and ran to him on small feet over cold wood, running so fast she almost tripped. Brennan dropped to his knees and Winnie crashed into him, her arms locked around his neck, so tight he nearly lost his balance, tight with the strength only a frightened child has when she finds safety again. "I knew Daddy would come," Winnie said into his shoulder, her voice trembling but not crying, because she had decided she wouldn't cry the whole time she was here. "I knew it. I counted to 10, and I said Daddy would come. Then I counted again. I counted a lot. Daddy." She called him Daddy, not in a dream, not by accident, but fully awake, fully choosing, with her whole 6-year-old heart. She called him by the name she had written under her drawings for so long. Brennan held his daughter, held her tight, with both arms, with his whole large body curved around her small one, as if he could turn himself into a wall between her and the world. And he cried, not hiding it, not controlling it, not turning away. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago knelt on the wooden floor inside his father's mansion, holding his 6-year-old daughter, and cried. Josie stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Monroe stood behind her, and she heard, very faintly, the sound of Monroe sniffing and turning away. That night Josie didn't leave Winnie for a single second. She lay on the bed in the safe apartment with her daughter tucked into her arms, her face buried in the child's black curls, breathing in the smell of baby shampoo mixed with the faint hospital scent that hadn't faded yet, and she held on so tightly that Winnie had to squirm and say, "Mommy, you're holding me too tight. I can't breathe." But Josie still didn't let go. She was afraid to let go, afraid that if she did, someone would take her child again, afraid with the raw, primitive fear only a mother who has nearly lost her child can understand. Brennan sat outside the bedroom door with his back against the wall, legs stretched out on the floor, eyes open all night. Monroe suggested he go rest, and Brennan didn't answer. Monroe suggested at least moving to the sofa, and Brennan didn't answer that either. He stayed there, guarding the door to his daughter's room. And Josie knew it, because she could hear his steady breathing through the door. The breathing of someone awake, not asleep. And she realized that tonight, for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't the only one keeping watch over Winnie's sleep. But life didn't give them time to breathe. 3 days later, just when Josie thought the storm had passed, when Winnie was laughing again and demanding Brennan make burned pancakes, Garrett Pruitt appeared. Josie was heading into her morning shift at the hotel because she refused to quit her job even though Brennan said she didn't need to, because she needed to know she could still stand on her own. And she had just stepped outside the building when she saw him on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, wearing that smile she recognized instantly even from nightmares. Garrett Pruitt, 34 years old, dirty blonde hair, square jaw, handsome in the way a snake is handsome, sleek and dangerous. 2 years she lived with him. 2 years he hit her. First slaps, then punches, then kicks, then twisted fingers. 2 years, she said, he's just stressed to explain the bruises. Until the night he beat her in front of Winnie, 2.5 years old, and the child screamed, "Don't hit Mommy," in a tiny, trembling voice. That night Josie ran and didn't look back. Now he stood there with his hands in his pockets, smiling. "Josie, long time." "What do you want?" Josie said, her voice flat while her heart pounded. "Heard you've got a new boyfriend. Real rich. New place. Your kid's living somewhere real nice." He tilted his head, his eyes cold. "I'm Winnie's legal father, Josie. On paper, my name's still there. And I'm starting to think maybe I should exercise my parental rights." You were never Winnie's father. The court thinks differently. What'll the court see? A single mother, in debt, 2 low-wage jobs, living off a gangster boyfriend everyone knows about. They won't leave the kid with you. His smile widened. Unless you want to negotiate. Josie understood. Garrett didn't want Winnie. Garrett wanted money. He'd heard she had a wealthy man beside her and he'd come to milk it. He always did. Always knew how to find a weakness and squeeze. She went back to the apartment, shaking not from fear of Garrett, but from fear of the law, fear of the courts, because she knew that on paper he was right. His name was still on Winnie's birth certificate because she'd never had the money to hire a lawyer to remove it. When she told Brennan, she saw something familiar pass through his eyes. Something cold, something dark. The same thing she'd seen when Raymond broke in, when Winnie was taken. Brennan said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "I can make him disappear. No one would ever find him." And he meant it. Josie knew he meant it. He had the power, the means, the people. Garrett Pruitt could vanish from the face of the earth, as if he'd never existed and no one would ask why. Josie looked straight into Brennan's eyes. She looked for a long time, deep, past the boss, past the darkness, into the 22-year-old she once loved, the man she was beginning to love again. "No," she said, her voice steady. "If you want to deserve being Winnie's father, then solve this in a way she can be proud of when she grows up and learns the truth, not in a way she'd have to be ashamed of." Brennan looked at her. His jaw tightened, the scar jumped, and she saw the fight inside him. The mafia instinct said kill. Josie said no. And Josie was the only person in the world that instinct ever lost to. "All right," he said after a long moment. Not entirely willing, but firm. "The best lawyer in Chicago. By the book. Clean." Then he paused, looked at her, and added more softly, "Because the way you look at me, I don't want to lose that." Josie didn't answer, but she understood that this wasn't Brennan obeying her. This was Brennan choosing to become the man she believed he could be, not because she forced him, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted someone to look at him and not see the darkness. And that person was her. The envelope arrived one morning with no stamp and no return name, slipped through the mail slot of the safe apartment door while Josie was warming milk for Winnie. It was thick and heavy, a large brown envelope, the kind people use for important documents. Josie picked it up, opened it, and everything she had been building with Brennan over the past weeks began to shake. Inside was a stack of papers nearly an inch thick. Photographs, reports, copies of police records, bank transfers. And on the very first page, written by hand in the neat, steady script of an old man, a single sentence read, "You are sleeping beside a monster. Read this, then decide what kind of man your daughter deserves to live with." Josie knew who sent it before she finished the line. Franklin. Even stripped of power, even confined to his mansion, he still had ways to reach out. Josie knew she should throw it away. She knew this was Franklin's tactic, to divide her from Brennan, to destroy what he could no longer control. But she didn't throw it away. She sent Winnie into the other room to watch cartoons, closed the kitchen door, sat at the table, and read. She read everything. Every page, every photograph, every number, and each page she turned felt like a cut. Josie had never believed Brennan was innocent. She had known that from the beginning. He was a mafia boss, not a florist. She knew violence was part of his world, that his empire was built on things that were not clean. But knowing in the abstract was nothing like seeing the details. Photos of men beaten for failing to pay debts to the Kessler organization. Records of money laundered through 13 shell companies. Files on 3 disappearances the police believed were linked to Brennan but lacked evidence to prosecute. Lists of assets with no legitimate origin. When Josie finished, she set the stack down and sat very still for a long time. Her hands were shaking. Not because she was afraid of Brennan. She had never been afraid of him. They were shaking because she was seeing the full picture for the first time, and it was darker than she had imagined. She asked Brennan to come over that evening after Winnie was asleep. She placed the stack of documents on the table between them. Brennan looked at the envelope, at Franklin's handwriting, and his expression didn't change. He had known this day would come. "You read it all?" he asked. "All of it. And what do you want me to say?" "The truth." Brennan met her eyes and didn't look away. Didn't dodge, didn't try to soften anything. "Everything in there is true," he said evenly, without excuses, without apology. "I did what it says. I gave the orders it describes. I built my empire with blood, with dirty money, with violence. I'm not innocent, Josie. I never claimed to be. 3 people disappeared, Josie said quietly. 3 people, with families, with children. Brennan drew a breath. I'm not asking you to forgive my past. I don't have the right to ask. Those people, their families, they're the ones who have that right, and they never will. I know that. He paused. I'm only asking you to believe that the man sitting in front of you now is trying to become someone else, not because I deserve it, but because you and Winnie deserve it. Josie looked at him for a long time. Then she asked the question she had been afraid to ask since she finished reading. How do I tell the difference between love and control, Brennan? You watched me for 7 years. You kept secrets with my aunt. You arranged my life from a distance without asking whether I wanted that. You call it protection. Your father called locking your mother away protection too. Brennan closed his eyes. The words struck the deepest wound, the one he questioned every night, the one he feared the most. I don't know where that line is, he said, his eyes still shut, his voice small and more honest than she had ever heard it. No one ever taught me how to love the right way. My father taught me that love meant ownership. My mother died before she could teach me anything else. I grew up in darkness, and I don't know where protection ends and control begins. He opened his eyes and looked at her. But you are the only person I have never lied to. From the night I carried you through the rain until this moment, I may be a monster to the rest of the world, but with you, I have never spoken a single untrue word. Josie looked at him. She looked at the face she had loved at 18, the face she had hated for 7 years, the face she was beginning to love again. She looked at the scar along his jaw, at the gray eyes that were hiding nothing now, and she felt her heart being pulled in 2 directions so hard she thought it might tear. I need time, she said. Don't come here for a few days. Brennan stood. He nodded, without pleading, without arguing, because he knew forcing Josie to stay was exactly what his father would have done, and he had sworn never to become Franklin. He walked to the door and stopped, without turning back. I'll be here, he said, whenever you're ready, or never. That's your choice. This time, I let you choose. Then he left. Josie sat alone at the kitchen table with the stack of documents in front of her and cried, not because Brennan was evil, not because she had been wrong, but because life had never given her a single, easy choice. Brennan called Monroe to his office at Kessler Holdings the next morning, early, before the staff arrived, when the building was still empty and the first sunlight of the day had only just touched the glass on the highest floor. Monroe walked in and saw Brennan standing by the window, looking down at Chicago the same way he had that night on the rooftop. And Monroe knew something big was coming because Brennan didn't turn around when the door opened, something he never did, because the boss always looked people in the eye. I'm leaving the Empire, Brennan said, still staring out the window. Monroe stayed still for 3 seconds. Then, say that again. I'm leaving the Empire. All of it. The routes, the network, the casinos, the docks, everything. Monroe stepped forward, his voice, for the first time Brennan had ever heard it, slipping out of control. You built this for 7 years, from a low-level soldier to the boss, from nothing to controlling half the city. You sacrificed everything for it. I built it to protect her, Brennan said, turning to look at him. For 7 years I told myself I needed power to keep Josie safe from a distance, that if I was strong enough, no one could touch her. But look at what just happened. This empire, this name, Kessler, the darkness I built, it almost killed my daughter. It gave Franklin leverage. It made Raymond bold enough to threaten. It made Josie look at me and see a monster instead of seeing me. He stopped. It served its purpose, Monroe. What I built to protect her is now the thing pushing her away. Monroe was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. The nod of a man who had followed Brennan long enough to know that when his boss decided, no one changed his mind. What stays? Monroe asked. Kessler Holdings. Real estate, hotels, the legitimate side. The rest gets transferred or dismantled. Clean. No trail back to me or Josie. Monroe nodded again and turned to handle it. At the door, he paused. Does she know you're doing this? Not yet, Brennan said, and I'm not doing it so she'll know. I'm doing it because it's right. 2 weeks later, when the transfer was nearly complete, Brennan went to Franklin's mansion one last time. Franklin was still in the leather chair by the fireplace, the glass of liquor on the table, Catherine's photograph above the mantel, Everything exactly as before, as if time had frozen inside that house. I heard, Franklin said without looking at Brennan. You're destroying everything. I'm giving it back, Brennan said, standing in the middle of the room, not sitting. The empire, the network, the name, all of it. You want it, it's there, but without me. And in exchange, one thing only. Josie and Winnie, you never touch them again. You don't look for them. You don't watch them. You don't send Raymond or anyone else. We do not exist to you. Franklin turned to look at Brennan, and in his eyes, if Josie had been there, she would have seen what she had glimpsed when Winnie said Daddy would come, something like loss buried under too many layers of cruelty. Kessler blood doesn't wash out, Brennan, he said, his voice almost sad. Wherever you go, you're still my son. The girl is still my granddaughter. Blood doesn't change. Maybe, Brennan said. Maybe blood doesn't wash out. But my daughter will never know the smell of that blood. She will grow up not knowing what the name Kessler means in the dark. She will only know it means her father loves her, and that's enough. Brennan turned and walked away. Down the hallway, through the massive doors, through the iron gate. He didn't look back. Not at the mansion where he grew up, where his mother died, where his father locked him up, where he became a monster. He stepped out into the sunlight, got into the car, and Monroe drove. In the rearview mirror, the mansion grew smaller, then vanished around the bend, and Brennan let out a long breath, the kind of breath he might have been holding for a very long time. Josie spent 5 days alone. 5 days of not calling Brennan, not taking his calls, not reading messages she knew he wasn't sending, because he'd told her he'd let her choose, and he'd kept his word. For 5 days she went to work, looked after Winnie, cooked, did laundry, did all the ordinary things she'd done on her own for 7 years, only this time each task echoed with a hollow space she hadn't realized had been filled before. The first night she lay staring at the ceiling and thought about the stack of documents, about the 3 missing people, about the money laundering records, and fear crawled through her. The second night she thought about the 22-year-old who'd kicked in the basement door, with blood on his hands that wasn't hers, who'd carried her through the rain, and she felt her heart soften. The third night she opened Aunt Della's tin box, counted the 84 envelopes again, read the letter again, and she cried because she missed her aunt, missed the scent of lavender, missed her aunt's voice saying, "You did so well." The fourth night she took 6 birthday cards from the wooden box in Winnie's room, reread each one, and lingered the longest on the one from the 6th year. "Father says your name every day so he won't forget." She pressed the card to her chest and thought that no one writes birthday cards for 6 years to a child they've never met if they're a monster. A monster doesn't know their child's name. A monster doesn't count the number of times they listen to a recording of their child's laughter. A monster doesn't prepare a room and change out toys every year for a child who may never set foot inside. On the 5th night, Phoebe came over. Josie told her everything, hiding nothing, from beginning to end. And Phoebe listened without interrupting, just drinking coffee and shaking her head a few times, not in judgment, but because she couldn't believe her friend's life was that complicated. When Josie finished, Phoebe was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't know anything about the Mafia. I don't know anything about the law. I don't know anything about crime. But I know one thing. No one writes birthday cards for 6 years to a child they've never met if they're a bad person, Josie. Bad people don't do that. Bad people forget." He didn't forget. Josie didn't answer Phoebe. But that night, while she was washing dishes, Winnie came out of her bedroom hugging her stuffed bear, her eyes heavy with sadness. "Mommy," the little girl said, her voice small and trembling in a way Josie recognized immediately as the edge of tears. "Why isn't Daddy coming anymore?" Josie knelt down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Daddy's busy, sweetheart." "Is Daddy going far away again?" Winnie asked, her bottom lip shaking. "Like before? You said Daddy had to go far away. Now is Daddy Brennan going far away again? Mommy? Why does every daddy go?" That question pierced Josie's chest sharper than anything Franklin had ever said, sharper than any line in that stack of criminal documents. Sharp because it came from a 6-year-old who'd grown used to being left behind, a child Josie had sworn no one would ever hurt. And she, by pushing Brennan away, was doing the very thing she'd sworn she wouldn't do. Josie pulled Winnie into her arms, kissed the top of her head, and said, "Daddy isn't going anywhere. I promise." She put Winnie back into bed, waited until she fell asleep, then picked up Aunt Della's old phone and dialed the contact labeled B. Brennan answered after the ringing. Still only after one ring, as if, for 7 years, he'd always been waiting. "Come here," Josie said. Brennan arrived in 20 minutes. Josie opened the door, and they faced each other on the threshold, and Josie said what she'd been thinking for 5 nights. "I don't forgive your past, Brennan. I don't have the right to forgive on behalf of the people you harmed. They're the ones who have that right, and I won't steal it from them." Brennan nodded, his eyes accepting it. "But I believe in the man you're trying to become. I saw you choose a lawyer instead of violence when Garrett showed up. I saw you let me choose instead of forcing me to stay. I believe that." She paused and drew a breath. "I've lived 7 years, Brennan. Survived. Every day was survival. But surviving and truly living aren't the same thing. I only realized that when you were here, because with you, I want to truly live. Not just breathe, not just get through the day, but live." Brennan stood on the threshold, and Josie saw his gray eyes wet but not spilling, held at the lash line like a lake about to overflow. She held out her hand. No hug, no kiss, just her rough hand, palm up, waiting. Brennan looked at her hand. Then he took it, held it tight, and didn't let go. They stood there in the doorway, hand in hand, saying nothing more. Because sometimes the greatest intimacy isn't a kiss, but a hand that won't release. 6 months later, on an October Saturday morning, Josie stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the small house in the southern suburbs of Chicago, and almost didn't recognize herself. Not because her appearance had changed much. She was still thin, still light brown-haired, still had rough hands, no lotion could ever truly soften. But her eyes were different. Her eyes no longer carried the look of someone counting days just to survive. They held something she'd forgotten the name of for a long time, and this morning she remembered it. Peace. 6 months changed a great deal. Brennan left the underground empire completely, cleanly, without a trace, exactly as he'd told Monroe he would. Kessler Holdings still operated, but only in legitimate sectors. Real estate, hotels, not a single dirty dollar. Franklin was moved to a care facility, cut off from the outside world, alive but stripped of power, without Raymond, without any pieces left to move. Josie was studying for her nursing degree at the community college. She attended evening classes and still worked morning shifts at the hotel, even though Brennan told her she didn't need to. "I need to know I can stand on my own," she said. And he didn't argue, because he'd learned that respecting Josie meant letting her choose, even when he wanted to give her everything. Winnie was healthier than she'd ever been. Her medication was consistent. Doctors followed her regularly. Her airway after surgery functioned well. She started first grade, carried her drawing notebook everywhere, and when the teacher asked who's in your family, she drew 3 people and said Mommy, me, and Daddy, with a pride so clear that when Josie heard it later over the phone from the teacher, she had to mute the call to cry. Garrett Pruitt lost the custody case. The lawyer Brennan hired presented evidence of abuse, medical reports of Josie's injuries from 4 years earlier that she hadn't known the hospital still kept, Phoebe's testimony, and the court not only dismissed Garrett's petition, but issued a restraining order barring him from coming near Josie and Winnie. Garrett vanished from their lives as if he'd never existed, and Josie didn't spare him a single thought. The small family lived in an ordinary 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. Not a penthouse, not a mansion. Brennan wanted it that way. "I want her to grow up normal," he said, and Josie agreed, because she'd had enough abnormality for a lifetime. Every Saturday morning was Daddy Winnie Day. Brennan took Winnie to buy donuts at the small shop 3 blocks from the house. She chose a chocolate donut. He chose a plain one because Daddy's old and too much sugar isn't good. And Winnie laughed and said, "Daddy isn't old, Daddy's just tall." Then the 2 of them sat in the park counting birds. Nothing complicated, nothing expensive. Just a father and daughter on a park bench, eating donuts, counting birds. Winnie said it was the best thing in the world. And Josie stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the 2 of them walk down the street every Saturday morning. And she thought that for the first time in her life, the future wasn't something to fear. That afternoon, the 3 of them went to the cemetery to visit Aunt Della's grave. The last time Josie had been there was the day of the funeral. Rain, cold, standing by the grave thinking she'd lost everything. Today the sun was out, gentle October sunlight, warm enough, and the cemetery wasn't bleak but peaceful. Green grass, yellow leaves, scattered along the gravel path. Josie placed a bouquet on Aunt Della's grave, lavender flowers because her aunt loved the scent of lavender, and she sat down beside the headstone. "Auntie," she said softly, "I was angry with you for a long time. Angry that you hid things from me. Angry that you knew and didn't tell me. There were moments I thought you'd betrayed me." She paused, breathing in the lavender. "But now I understand. You loved me with a kind of sacrifice I couldn't see. Like him. Both you and he loved me, by enduring alone so I could be safe. I don't know if that's the right way, but I know it was the only way you had." Winnie knelt beside her mother and placed a new drawing on the grave. The picture showed 3 people. A brown-haired woman, a dark-haired little girl, and a tall man. Underneath, in first-grade handwriting, far neater than the scribbles from the year before, she'd written, "My family." And in the top corner of the drawing, among clouds colored in white crayon, was a tiny woman with wings. Beside her were the words, "Grandma Della in heaven." Brennan stood behind them, silent, giving Josie and Winnie their private space with Aunt Della. But when mother and daughter stood up and Winnie ran off to collect yellow leaves, Brennan stepped forward to the grave. He stood there for a moment, then spoke softly. So softly it would only reach her if she were listening from somewhere else. "Thank you. For keeping them safe when I couldn't. For taking the envelope every month without judging me. For telling me about Winnie so I had a reason to live through each day. I kept my promise to you, Della." I stepped out of the darkness. Josie stood a few steps away, heard every word, and walked over, leaning into him, her head resting against his shoulder. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gentle. And they stood like that beside Aunt Della's grave, under the October sun, with Winnie running around collecting leaves, and for the first time Josie stood in this cemetery without crying. That evening, after Winnie fell fast asleep with the drawing labeled, "My family," resting on the nightstand, Brennan took Josie's hand and led her out onto the porch. It was a small porch, only big enough for 2 wooden chairs and a flower pot Winnie had planted the week before. The bud's still closed, but she watered it every day because Daddy said you have to be patient. The Chicago October sky was crystal clear, cold enough that their breath showed, and the stars looked brighter than any other night. Or maybe Josie only felt that way because this was the first time she'd lifted her eyes to the sky without wondering how hard tomorrow would be. Brennan stood beside her, quiet for a moment, looking up, then looking at her. And Josie saw him take a deep breath in a way she recognized as nerves. The retired Mafia Boss, the man who once controlled half the city, was standing on a small suburban porch, nervous, with the woman he'd loved since he was 22. "Josie," he said, and his voice trembled, only slightly. But she heard it because she'd learned every shade of his voice over these past months. "I have something." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Not a luxurious velvet box from a jeweler, but a worn cardboard one, corners frayed, the lid slightly warped because it had been opened and closed too many times over too many years. Josie recognized it before he lifted the lid. She recognized it because she'd seen it once, 7 years earlier, in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment, when Brennan, at 22, had pulled it from under the mattress and shown it to her with the widest smile she'd ever seen on his face. "Someday," he'd said then, 22, thin, broke, eyes bright. "Someday I'll be worthy enough to put it on your hand." Now he opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, delicate, plain, no stone, no engraving, just a small band of silver he'd bought with his first paycheck when he was still a low-level runner. A meager paycheck he'd saved for 3 months, skipping lunch, to buy the cheapest ring in a little corner jewelry shop. And he'd kept it for 7 years. Through everything. Through the night he left. Through 7 years of building an empire. Through blood and darkness. Through the nights he'd sat alone in an expensive penthouse that felt empty. The small box always in the bedside drawer. "I could buy you any ring in the world," Brennan said, his voice low and sincere in a way she knew wasn't performance. "Diamonds, gold, anything. But this one," he looked down at the fragile silver band lying in the old cardboard box. "This one is who I was before the darkness, before Franklin, before the empire, before the blood. This is the 22-year-old who tarried you through the rain, who burned everything he tried to cook, who lay on the rooftop counting stars with you. This is the man you loved, and I need you to know, he never died. He was just buried deep, and you dug him back out." Josie stared at the ring, and tears slid down her face, but she smiled for the first time through tears that weren't made of pain. "You're still that man, Brennan," she said. You just forgot. But I remember. I've always remembered. Brennan went down on one knee on the wooden porch floor, one hand holding the small box, gray eyes lifted to hers, and Josie saw no darkness in them, no boss, no scar, only the 22-year-old she'd loved on the rooftop of a cheap apartment 7 years ago. Josephine Calloway, he said, and his voice broke on her name in the most beautiful way her name had ever been spoken. I've loved you since I had nothing but blood on my hands and a heart that didn't know how to love the right way. I loved you even when I had the whole world without you, and that whole world was empty. Will you give me the chance to stand beside you and Winnie, not in the dark, but in the light? Josie looked down at him, at the man kneeling in front of her on a small suburban porch, a cheap silver ring in his hand, and she thought about 7 years. 7 years of anger, 7 years of longing, 7 years of pretending she'd forgotten, while never forgetting. This isn't the last chance, she said, her voice shaking but steady. Shaking with feeling, not fear. This is the only chance. Because I never stopped waiting for you, Brennan. Even when I hated you, I still waited. Brennan slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, as if it had always belonged there. As if it had been lying in that box for 7 years, only because it was waiting for this exact moment. Then came the sound of small footsteps. They both turned. Winnie stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, black curls messy, wearing dinosaur pajamas, staring at Brennan kneeling in front of her mother with wide blue eyes. "What's Daddy doing?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Josie laughed through her tears. "Daddy's asking Mommy to marry him, sweetheart." Winnie went still for a second. Then her face lit up, brighter than the stars over Chicago, and she jumped with both feet, shouting with all the strength of 6-year-old lungs that had made it through airway surgery and come out strong. "Say yes. Mommy, say yes." Then she ran onto the porch and launched herself at Brennan, and he scooped her up with one arm, his other arm pulling Josie in, and the three of them held each other on the small porch under the Chicago stars, in Winnie's laughter, in the tears of 2 grown-ups, and in the fragile silver ring on Josie's finger catching starlight. Josie closed her eyes, rested her head against Brennan's chest, felt Winnie between them, warm, alive, breathing, and she thought about the rainy afternoon at the cemetery, the day she'd believed she'd lost everything. But life doesn't take everything without giving something back. Sometimes it takes until you're strong enough, scarred enough, broken enough, and then it returns the thing you needed most when you're brave enough to accept it. Some scars would never disappear. The scar along Brennan's jaw, the scar inside Josie's heart, her crooked little finger, broken and never properly set. 7 years apart. But some hands, even hands that once carried blood, can learn to be gentle. Some hearts, even hearts that once shattered, can learn to beat in the same rhythm again. And the most beautiful love story isn't the one that begins with "once upon a time." The most beautiful love story begins with "after all that time" and ends with a single word: still. Thank you for listening to the story of Josie, Brennan, and little Winnie. I hope this story reminds all of us that love doesn't always arrive on time. But if it's real enough, it'll find its way back. That strength doesn't mean you never fall. It means you get back up every time, and you keep your heart soft. And that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the people who choose to stay when the whole world walks away. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support us so we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. Share this video with someone you love, someone you think needs to hear that after everything, love is still here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to know how you felt. Was there a moment in the story that made you cry? Was there a detail that made you think of your own real life? Share your feelings in the comments below. We read every comment, and we cherish every word from the bottom of our hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness each day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.